November 24th, 1971, the day before Thanksgiving. At the Portland airport, in the gray damp of a Pacific Northwest afternoon, a man walked up to the Northwest Orient counter, paid cash for a one-way ticket to Seattle, and gave a name. He did not look like the kind of man history was about to trip over itself remembering. He looked fine, and that's almost the creepiest part. Dark suit, white shirt, black tie, raincoat. He was middle-aged, calm, and clean-cut in that aggressively unmemorable way that says either middle management or I sell life insurance and ruin dinner parties. Nothing about him flashed. Nothing about him lingered. He looked like the sort of man your eyes would slide past in an airport and never return to. As he boarded the plane, he took a seat near the rear. He ordered a bourbon and soda and lit a cigarette and waited, which, in hindsight, is a chilling verb. Waited. Because there's something deeply unsettling about a person who already knows exactly how the evening is going to go. After takeoff, he handed a folded note to a flight attendant. At first, she barely looked at it. And honestly, that makes sense. Flight attendants in that era got handed all kinds of nonsense. Phone numbers, pickup lines, little scraps of male delusion scribbled at cruising altitude. But this was not that. He leaned forward and quietly told her that she should read it. And so she did. And just like that, the flight split in two. The version where everybody thought they were going to Seattle, and the version where they were suddenly inside a hijacking. The note said that he had a bomb in his briefcase and told her to sit with him. And when she did, he cracked the briefcase open just enough for her to see wires and a red-colored cylinder inside. Then he gave his demands. $200,000 in $20 bills, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck waiting in Seattle. And this is where the story stops feeling like a crime report, starts feeling like something almost mythological. Because he didn't bark those demands, he didn't rant, he didn't foam at the mouth or pound his fists or do the theatrical nonsense movies train us to expect from desperate men. He was calm. Calm in a way that gets under your skin. Calm in a way that makes everyone else more afraid. He delivered his demands like a businessman clarifying invoice terms, like a man sending back a side dish, like someone who had already rehearsed the evening so many times in his head that now he was simply moving from one checkpoint to the next. And that kind of composure, well, that sticks in the ribs. Because panic makes sense. Fear makes sense. Adrenaline makes sense. But a man who can hijack a plane with the emotional temperature of someone discussing umbrella warranties, well, that's haunting. By the time the aircraft landed in Seattle, he had done the impossible with almost embarrassing efficiency. He secured the ransom, obtained the parachutes, and traded a cabin full of passengers for an empty plane and a handful of terrified crew. And then he sent the plane back into the air. Outside it was night, or storm clouds raging, as well as wind and rain. The Boeing 727 climbed into the darkness with a man in the rear cabin carrying cash, parachutes, and a plan no one else on Earth fully understood. A little after 8 p.m., somewhere between Seattle and Reno, he lowered the rear stairs. And then, with a bag of money strapped to him and a black clip-on tie left behind on his seat, he stepped out into the void. No confirmed body, no confirmed identity, just fragments left over. A tie clip, and a handful of witness memories. Years later, a decaying ransom bills found by a boy on the banks of the Columbia River. That's it. Which is exactly why this story metastasized. Because history hates a vacuum, and when facts leave a gap, folklore comes sprinting in like it pays rent there. Over the years, a man in the suit stopped being just a hijacker and became something stranger. A folk ghost, a campfire criminal, a patron saint of vanishing acts. Part outlaw, part mystery, part American hallucination in loafers. And even the name most people know him by, the name that made him immortal, wasn't quite right. The man who boarded that plane called himself Dan Cooper, but history remembers him as D.B. Cooper. Hey there, history nerds and curious weirdos. Welcome back to Naked History, the show where we rip the fig leaf off the past and find out that human history is quite often one part tragedy, one part absurdity, and one part somebody absolutely refusing to explain themselves. I'm your host, Dyllan Gasaway, and today we're talking about one of America's cleanest, strangest, and most aggressively stylish unsolved mysteries, D.B. Cooper. This story has everything. Air travel in the early 1970s, a hijacker who somehow manages to be both deeply criminal and weirdly polite, a ransom note delivered on a tarmac, and a jump into storm dark wilderness. A vanishing act so complete that more than 50 years later, we still can't say for certain whether this man died in the woods 5 minutes after he leapt, or landed, walked out, changed clothes, and spent the rest of his life quietly enjoying the greatest "you'll never believe what I got away with" story in modern American folklore. The FBI still frames the case that way. His identity and ultimate fate remain unknown. And that's what makes Cooper so powerful as a historical figure. He's not just a criminal, he's a blank space. And people love blank spaces, because blank spaces let us write whatever version of reality we prefer. A mastermind, an idiot, a veteran, an opportunist, a daredevil, or a dead man, or even a living ghost. D.B. Cooper is the rare outlaw who became more compelling the less anyone could prove. And honestly, America loves that kind of outlaw. So today we're going to walk through the hijacking itself, the jump, the search, the clues, the suspects, and the theories, and why this one man in a business suit has stayed lodged in the national imagination for more than half a century. Because whether he survived or not, D.B. Cooper got the one thing almost every outlaw secretly wants. He became bigger than the crime. So let's start with a setup, because this story only works if it begins in a place that feels painfully normal. It was November 24th of 1971. It was Thanksgiving Eve, one of the heaviest travel days of the year even then. Northwest Orient Flight 305 is scheduled to make a short hop from Portland to Seattle. It was routine and unremarkable, giving you barely enough time to settle in, have a drink, and think about whether your relatives are going to ask you the same 3 questions again over dry turkey. The FBI says Cooper bought the plane ticket that afternoon in Portland with cash and boarded for the brief Seattle flight. Now, the man who buys the ticket gives the name Dan Cooper. Not D.B. Cooper, just Dan Cooper. And that distinction matters because, thanks to press confusion, the world would know him by the wrong name forever. One FBI retrospective notes that the enduring D.B. label was the result of a media mistake. So he boards the plane. Witnesses' descriptions vary a little around the edges, but the overall picture is consistent. White male, mid-40s, dark hair, a business suit, a black tie, white shirt, and a raincoat. The FBI summary describes him as quiet in his mid-40s, wearing a business suit with a black tie and a white shirt. Again, as well in the witness descriptions, describe him about 6'1", 170, 175 pounds, with brown eyes and black hair. In other words, not flashy. And that may be the first genius move, because nothing hides better than normal. Not memorable, not eccentric, not loud, and definitely not threatening in an obvious way. He orders a bourbon and a soda while the flight is waiting to take off. And I love and hate that detail equally because it makes the whole thing feel cooler than it should. The bourbon and soda is a very calm drink order for a man about to hijack a plane. It either suggests nerves of steel or a level of emotional detachment that is frankly not what you want in a seat wherever he was sitting behind you. And then, after takeoff, he hands over the note. That's the moment that the whole century splits open. Because before that, he's just another passenger. After that, he becomes a legend. Flight attendant Florence Schaffner originally gets the note. Now, she doesn't immediately realize what it is, which makes sense. Human beings are actually pretty bad at leaping instantly to the worst possible interpretation of things unless life trains them to. But Cooper tells her to sit beside him, and when she does, he opens his briefcase enough for her to see the wires and red sticks. Now, there is something darkly important about the way he handles this moment. He doesn't explode emotionally, he doesn't posture, he doesn't turn the cabin into theater. He acts like a man who already believes that he is in control. And that matters in a hostage situation, because calm can be more frightening than rage. Rage is unstable. Rage may lose the plot, but cold control, well, that feels procedural. It feels planned. It tells everybody else in the room that this person walked in expecting you to become part of the script. And Cooper absolutely had a script. He dictates the demands. He asks for 4 parachutes, and $200,000 in $20 bills, and a fuel truck standing by on landing. Schaffner carries the message forward, and the plane begins circling over the Seattle area while authorities scramble on the ground. Passengers, according to later accounts, are told that there's a minor mechanical issue, and so the plane needed to burn fuel and extend the flight. Imagine being one of those passengers. You think your flight is delayed because something on the plane needs attention. It's annoying, sure, maybe mildly unsettling, but survivable. Meanwhile, just a few rows away, a man is negotiating a ransom, planning to jump in the Pacific Northwest with a bag full of cash. And that's definitely one of the most bizarre mismatches of experiences. It's one of those moments where history reminds you that catastrophe often arrives very unevenly. Some people are having the worst, strangest day of their lives, and other people are just wondering if they're going to make their connection. And all the while, Cooper keeps the temperature low. And that's probably the most haunting part of this case, because he didn't need to be dramatic, because he understood that authority comes from certainty, not volume. He knew what he wanted, and he knew how to ask for it. And he knew everybody else would rush to fill the silence. After roughly 3.5 hours in the air, Flight 305 lands in Seattle. On the ground, Cooper gets exactly what he demanded: the $200,000 in cash and the 4 parachutes, which he trades for all 36 passengers on board and 2 of the 6 crew members. So if you're keeping score, this is the point where the story should, logically, start becoming easier to solve. This man has made contact and has revealed himself to witnesses. He has left physical evidence, and he's narrowed his options. He's on an airplane, and there are federal authorities involved. This should be the beginning of the end. Instead, it's the beginning of the real mystery. Because once the passengers are gone, the crime changes shape. It is no longer a hijacking in the ordinary sense. It's now an escape plan. Now, Cooper orders the plane to take off again, headed south, with Mexico City as the broad destination, though the actual route requires compromises. The Boeing 727 cannot just elegantly glide into whatever criminal fantasy he had in mind. It needs refueling. And it has performance limits, and it has a crew trying very hard not to die. So the second leg is structured around reality. A lower altitude with a lower speed, and Reno as a refueling stop. The FBI says the plane took off again after Seattle set a course for Mexico City, and Cooper jumped somewhere between Seattle and Reno a little after 8 p.m. And this is where the plane itself becomes one of the most important characters in the story. Because Flight 305 was a Boeing 727, and the 727 had a feature that made this crime possible in the most cinematic way imaginable: a rear set of air stairs that could be lowered in flight. If this had maybe been a different plane, this story ends differently. Maybe Cooper is trapped by his own plan. There is no leap into darkness. Maybe we know his face, his fingerprints, his real name, and the exact federal prison where his mythology went to die. But history is not built from maybe. History is built from the machine that happened to be there. And that machine was a 727 with stairs in the back, which meant for a few hours on one November night, the sky itself could become an exit. Now, with passengers gone, the cabin mostly empty, the crew forward, the plane heading south through rain and darkness, Cooper was in the back with the money and the parachutes. He tells the crew to remain in the cockpit, and at some point the rear stairs are lowered. There is a pressure change. It was enough for the crew to know something had happened, and a little after 8 p.m., somewhere between Seattle and Reno, Dan Cooper steps off the back of the airplane and into the stormy night. And America has never let that image go, because mainly it's too perfect. A man in a suit with a bag of money, equipped with a parachute, and hopes in a storm. It feels written, too written, almost. Like the kind of scene a screenwriter would pitch and get told to pull back because audiences say that it's too on the nose, too much myth and not enough reality. And yet, there it is, the reality. Now, here is where the case gets a little slippery, because the jump sounds cool. It sounds controlled, and it sounds like the move of a criminal genius with military experience, jump training, and a map waiting on the ground. But the actual conditions, well, those were a lot brutal than we like to think. It was night, it was rain, it was cold, he was jumping into rough terrain with heavy woods and very poor visibility. According to the FBI, the parachute that he used could not be steered. They also note his clothing and footwear were unsuitable for a rough landing, and they explicitly say the evidence suggests he was not a seasoned pro people sometimes imagine. And this is an important reality check, because the myth of D.B. Cooper depends heavily on the idea that he was a skyjacking mastermind who knew exactly what he was doing. The FBI themselves have long been more skeptical. Not because the jump didn't happen, but it absolutely did, but because doing a dangerous thing calmly is not the same as doing it wisely. There's a difference between courage and overconfidence that only becomes obvious once gravity gets a vote. Still, whether he was prepared or recklessly improvising, he went. And once he did, he became very hard to drag back down into a plain old criminal fact. Because the jump is not just the climax of the crime, it's the birth of the myth. The pilots land the plane safety, and Cooper is gone. The FBI opens what becomes one of the most famous investigations in its history, NORJAC, or short for Northwest Hijacking. The agents interview hundreds of people, follow leads all across the country, and scour the aircraft for evidence. By the FBI's own account, more than 800 suspects had been considered within 5 years, with all but a couple dozen eliminated. Think about that. 800 suspects. That's not a case. That is a national fever dream with paperwork. And what they have to work with is maddeningly incomplete. Cooper took the ransom note back from the flight attendant, eliminating one obvious piece of evidence. Now, he did leave some things behind, such as cigarette butts, according to later accounts, as well as a clip-on black tie and a tie clip, which the FBI emphasizes as an important physical item because it held DNA sampling, though not one that solved the mystery. And this is where the case gets infuriating in the very specific way unsolved cases do. There is evidence, there are witnesses, there are objects, and there are leads, but none of it closes. It all just kind of hovers. It's enough to keep the story alive, but not enough to end it. Now, search teams comb likely areas in the Pacific Northwest. The area and terrain are very difficult, and the weather had been bad. Time isn't on anyone's side jumping into that, and every hour that passes without a body, without gear, without a clear trail, makes Cooper less like a suspect and more like a rumor with a boarding pass. And that's how folklore happens. Not when something impossible occurs, but when something just barely possible refuses to resolve. And, of course, the Pacific Northwest is the perfect landscape for that kind of story. Deep woods, rivers, mountains, weather, distances that look manageable on a map until the actual Earth rises up and reminds you that it has no interest in helping federal agents tidy up an ending. By the time the initial searches fail to produce any clean answer, country already has what it wants. A mystery that it can keep. So let's sit with the central question. Did he survive? Now, this is the argument that powers the entire Cooper industry. Books, documentaries, suspect boards, internet threads, true crime specials, bar conversations, and at least 1,000 people leaning back in their chairs and say, now here's my theory. Now, on one side, you have the survival skeptics. And to be fair, they have a lot to work with. The FBI's assessment points says that the parachute Cooper used wasn't steerable, the terrain was wooded, it was night, the weather was poor, and his clothing was not ideal for a hard landing. They go further and say that the evidence suggests that he was not a seasoned parachuting professional that many had imagined. And that is not nothing. It's a pretty brutal set of conditions. If you strip away the legend and you just say the sentence plainly, a man in a business suit jumped out of a jet at night into rough weather over heavily wooded country with a bag full of cash, it sounds less and less like a perfect heist and more like a very committed way to lose an argument with the ground. But on the other side, survival believers point to his composure, his very specific demands, and his apparent familiarity with the aircraft's rear stairs. Also, the fact that no body has ever conclusively tied itself to the crime. The case remained open for decades, and while the FBI did deprioritize it in 2016, it did not mark it as solved. And there's also something else. People want him to have survived. And that matters, because if he died on impact, the story becomes grim and finite. It's still fascinating, but it's smaller and sadder. But if he lived, well, if he landed and hid the chute, found a road, got picked up, and vanished into another name, another town, or another life, then the story becomes irresistible. Then he is not merely unsolved, he is triumphant. And American culture has always had a soft spot for outlaws who seem smarter than the machine built to catch them. There's also a little odd theory that the alias Dan Cooper may have come from a Belgian comic book character. In a 2009 FBI feature, Special Agent Larry Carr said that he believed it was possible the hijacker took the name from the comic, noting that the enduring DB came from a media mistake and that the comic had not been translated into English. Carr used that as part of a broader theory that Cooper may have spent some time overseas. Now, that definitely does not solve the case, but it does add some texture. Because Cooper is one of those mysteries where every plausible detail feels like it belongs in a novel. A mystery alias, a possible comic book reference, and a man jumping into the night from the rear stairs of a 727. History occasionally gets very dramatic when nobody's looking. Then, in 1980, the case gets one of its eeriest twists. A young boy vacationing with his family at Tina Bar on the Columbia River finds rotting bundles of cash buried in the sand. The total is about $5,800, and the serial numbers match the ransom money from the Cooper hijacking. The FBI notes that this discovery was one of the biggest physical clues in the entire case. And this is the kind of clue that would normally solve a mystery. But this is anything but a normal mystery. So instead of answering the question, the money makes everything weirder. How did it get there? Was it carried by the water? Was it buried intentionally? Maybe it was lost in transit? Or was it maybe dropped during the jump? Was it part of the ransom stash separated from the rest? Unfortunately, bills don't speak. They just rot ominously. And that's almost worse, because physical evidence is supposed to narrow things down. It's supposed to reward patience. It's supposed to let the world become less mysterious in exchange for hard enough work and enough forensics. But sometimes evidence does the opposite, because sometimes it proves the story is real while making the ending even harder to touch. And the Tina bar money is just like that. It tells you that at least some of the ransom ended up there, but that's it. No neat line from plane to riverbank, no confirmed sequence, definitely no body, no confession, and no single clear theory that locks the whole machine into place. Just spoiled cash from the skyjacking that refuses, even decades later, to stop asking questions. Which is maybe the most D.B. Cooper clue imaginable. Not a revelation, but a historical taunt. And talking about D.B. Cooper, one of my favorite parts of this whole case is that even the name is wrong. Or more precisely, the name we remember is wrong. The man bought the ticket as Dan Cooper. That's the alias attached to the actual crime, but the name D.B. Cooper took hold because of reporting confusion, and once the media mistake spread, it struck. And that feels weirdly perfect, because it means the myth was flawed from birth. The country didn't just inherit a mystery, it inherited a typo and made it immortal. And it's such a beautiful little American detail. We didn't merely mythologize a skyjacker, we mythologized him so inaccurately, and then refused to let the correction ruin a perfectly good legend. Now, for Dan Cooper, or D.B. Cooper, however you want to call him, there have been endless suspects over the years. The FBI investigated many of them, and one of the most persistent names in public discussion is Richard Floyd McCoy, who carried out a similar hijacking less than 5 months later, but the FBI says McCoy was ruled out because he didn't match the physical descriptions given by the 2 flight attendants, and for other various reasons. And that pattern repeats across the case again and again. There's an interesting suspect and a promising angle, and definitely a compelling theory, but not enough evidence. The FBI ultimately redirected resources away from the case in 2016, not because the mystery had been solved, but because the investigation was no longer the best use of agency resources. It still says it will review specific physical evidence related to parachutes or the money if anything genuinely new appears. And that is where the official case ends. Not with certainty, not with justice, not with a reveal, but with a shrug sophisticated enough to wear a federal badge. But culturally, the case never ended, because some mysteries are just too elegant to die. So why are we still so obsessed with D.B. Cooper? Well, part of it is the image, obviously. The suit, the briefcase, the note, the bourbon and soda, the parachute, and the stairs lowering into the black air. It's one of the most visually complete mysteries in American history. But more than that, Cooper arrived at the exact intersection of system and myth. He hijacked a modern machine in a world full of airline schedules, ticket counters, federal agencies, and mass media, and then still escaped into a space that felt old and unknowable. The night sky, wilderness, weather, and distance. And he took a crime that should have been trapped in paperwork and turned it into folklore. That is rare. That's why I think this case keeps breathing. Because Cooper represents a fantasy that modern life almost never allows anymore. The fantasy that a person can still slip through the gears. That he can understand the system well enough to use it, wound it, embarrass it, and then step sideways out of the record before it closes around him. And that fantasy is powerful. Dangerous, yes, and definitely romanticized far too often, but absolutely powerful. And the blankness helps. The less we know, the more effectively he fits whatever version of the story that we want. If you like competence, he becomes a mastermind. If you like the irony, he becomes the fool who died in trees. And if you like conspiracy, he becomes a trained operator with a hidden life. If you like ghost stories, he becomes America's favorite disappearing man. And the truth may be smaller than myth. And honestly, it probably is. Most truths are. But history does not always belong to the most provable version of events. Sometimes it belongs to the version that the people can't stop retelling. And D.B. Cooper is one of the great retellable stories. A man gave a false name, boarded a plane, asked for money and parachutes, and then left into the dark, leaving nothing behind but just enough evidence to prove that he was real. Not enough to catch him, not enough to understand him, just enough to make forgetting impossible. And whether he died that night or lived long enough to hear his own legend harden in public memory, D.B. Cooper pulled off the one vanishing act most criminals never do. He disappeared into the story. So that is the story of D.B. Cooper, or Dan Cooper if we're being historically accurate and slightly less cinematic. The man who hijacked a plane, took the money, jumped into the night, and left the rest of us arguing about him for the next half-century. If there's a lesson here, it might be that history is not always built by kings and presidents and generals. Sometimes it's built by one extremely calm man with a tie clip and a terrible plan that may or may not have worked. So, thank you again for hanging out with me for this episode of Naked History. And if you like this one, follow the show, leave a rating, and share it with your favorite history nerd, your favorite curious weirdo, or your favorite friend who absolutely would say, okay, but hear me out, I think he made it. And as always, stay curious, stay skeptical, and maybe don't step off the back of an airplane into a thunderstorm with a ransom bag. As always, I have been Dyllan Gasaway, and this has been Naked History. I'll see you next time in the debrief, where we go over some plausible theories of the disappearance of D.B. Cooper. Maybe we'll figure out somebody that no one else has. Or maybe we just get stuck in the same old that history loves to give us. Alright, have a good one, and we'll see you next time.